All right, students, let's go ahead and get settled in. If you need to get a pen out, good time to do that now so you're not that person ruffling through your backpack, making a bunch of noise. Thank you for coming inside today on a day that it's 75 degrees and sunny out. That's a really hard competitor to fight against with your attention, so really do appreciate it. As you know, I normally, and Haley, do you mind if I grab the clicker from you so I can cycle through? Normally go through a little bit of a hype moment where we talk about our guests and I tell you about how amazing they are coming in, but per my corny jokes about Friday's gonna Schox you, I didn't want to steal his thunder. So, without a whole lot of further ado, I want you to help me today in welcoming who is a two-time U of M grad with a little bit of a break in between, mechanical engineering department. Show of hands, how many of you mechanical engineering majors? Okay, a couple of you in there. Elise is psyched to have you on board. How many of you are EE majors? I would have thought that number was reversed. Okay, a couple more there. That's okay if we don't have it. That's okay, you can advance it as we go. Yeah, okay. So, Jeff Schox is who I'm talking about. Jeff's here today to join us. Welcome. Let's give him a round of applause for coming out to Ann Arbor. Appreciate it. If you could, though they may have read snippets of you online, let's give them a little bit of a sense of where you came from and your story before you became who you are today.
I'd be happy to. I grew up in Troy, so not too far from here. My dad went to the University of Michigan, so I have a little photo of me carrying a little Michigan football when I was like 2 years old or something. I was kind of destined to come here. And in undergrad, I studied mechanical engineering here. And I always wanted to be an automotive engineer. I got really lucky, and I did a couple summers at General Motors. I worked on the electric vehicle, the very first one, like back in the early 90s. Worked on Corvette handling. My first couple summers were amazing. And then by my third summer, I had this moment where I was working on oil pressure sensor testing rigs. And oil pressure sensors, you would think that maybe a company like General Motors would have, maybe like 5 or 6, maybe for a V6 or an inline 4 or a diesel or something. And they had 64 completely different oil pressure sensors. And that just kind of like boggled my mind of just like, why do we do that? And it was like, well, Bob's been here a really long time, and Sally, plays golf with the president, and it was just like the most ridiculous answers, really disheartening. And I realized at that moment that maybe this isn't the right place for me. And I had this early life crisis because this is all I wanted to do. Both my parents were automotive engineers at Chrysler. That's where they met. They met in a back seat.
I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah, they met in a back seat of a car. My mom was a chemical engineer. My dad was a mechanical engineer. And that's all I wanted to do. And I got there and I didn't want to do that and freaked out. My mentor pulled me aside and said, I have a good friend that's a patent attorney. Maybe you should go into patent law. I shadowed a couple people. I ended up going to law school out in the East Coast and right in DC. I worked at a big law firm doing patent searches during the day. And I graduated, came back to Ann Arbor. I was working for a couple of the prominent firms here in Ann Arbor. And about 5 or 6 years into my career, it was being kind of rumored that I was going to be, close to a partner level. And I was doing particularly well. And I looked around and I was like, I don't want to partner with these folks. And this was the destination, right? Being partner is the title. That's what you're supposed to be doing. And that's not what I wanted. But I happen to have this journal of all the things that I would do if I was in charge. And I didn't really have much of an entrepreneurial bent. I took 1 or 2 classes at Michigan. But I just, all of a sudden, this kind of bloomed inside of me that maybe I could do this. And so this is 2003. I went back to school. I got my EECS degree. I started teaching a patent law class here at Michigan.
Well, before you go too far, you told me a story a minute ago about when you came back to school. And so bear in mind, Jeff's coming back to school. It's 2003. At this point, he's 10 years out of undergrad. You could give them what you told them.
It was a little painful, and like going back to some of the buildings here was a little painful. I didn't have an EECS undergrad. I am a mechanical undergrad, and 10 years out of school. And there was a particular class that I had signed up for, and the professor had all of these equations on the board. And I was like, oh, like this is what we're gonna learn, like this semester, like this is great. No, he explained that like you should have mastery of every single one of these equations. I had never seen any of these equations before in my entire life. And in fact, there was a symbol, like an X with a circle around it. And I was like, I don't even know what that symbol means. And so it was like, I think I'm in the wrong place. I had a great advisor, and we worked out a deal of like the classes, and I would end up graduating. But yes, I have kind of an interesting relationship with that period of my life. But I had thrown a bunch of spaghetti up against the wall, teaching, getting another degree, and starting my own firm, hoping that one of them would work out. And it turned out that they all kind of worked out really, really nicely together. By having an EECS degree on top of my mechanical degree, I was perfectly situated to do the smart device wave in patent law, and a bunch of wearables, and like basically putting all this intelligence into hardware. And all of that worked incredibly well for me. And then at the end of my class, one of my best students came up and said, I'm moving to San Francisco as well. I'd love to come work for you. And it just kind of dawned on me that like, oh, in addition to being able to teach engineers or something about patent law, every once in a while, I might actually have like a great employee that comes out of it. And so that all worked out really well.
Okay. Let's back that up a second here. Before you go to San Francisco, you're in Ann Arbor, you're going through the EECS degree, you're working on your firm. Talk to us a little bit, what's that experience? What is the Schox PLC at that point in time? What is the market here at that point in time? Give them a lay of the land. Show of hands, how many of you were born around 2003 or 4? Okay, you got to paint the picture.
Yeah, and so early days of entrepreneurship here in Ann Arbor. And there was this Great Lakes entrepreneurial quest, all the best startups in the area. And within my first year of being on my own, I had 3 out of the 5, finalists. And I was like, then like 3 out of the 5 of the finalists were my clients. And it was like, maybe there's not a lot of room to grow here at this particular time. At the moment, the entrepreneurial scene here is absolutely thriving and super excited about it. But back in 03, 04, it was definitely in the early nascent days.
Okay. Helpful.
So we move out to the Bay Area.
Move out to the Bay Area, and you're able to do that, and you convinced your then wife of 2 years at that point?
Yep, exactly right.
Okay.
And I did a lot of hustling. So moving and trying to start a professional firm in a brand new state where I knew one person was really, really, really hard. I went to meetups like 8 times a week. And
give them a sense of what is the San Francisco startup scene at that point, a Bay Area startup scene, because it's not in San Francisco really at that point in time.
Yeah, and so it was post the boom and the crash, but it was like kind of starting to like build up again.
The dot-com boom and crash of 2000-ish.
Yep. And so it was like starting to come back up, and it was a great time to be in San Francisco. You could afford it, which was awesome. But also, like that meant that startups were actually moving to San Francisco, and so there was a lot that was moving from the Palo Alto, Menlo Park, Mountain View area up to San Francisco, and so I got lucky with the timing of that.
Okay. So now we should talk about investing a little bit.
Close, and so I was there hustling for about 7 years. It was about that time that I started doing the Twilio work and the Duo work, and we could talk a little bit about that. But all of a sudden, after 7 years, my firm became an overnight success. And we went from outbound of me trying to get every single client to, my God, we have 300 or 400 companies coming to us annually, and we could take on about 20 or 30. And it was at that moment that I had this little insight that if I'm going to pick 20 or 30 out of 400, that kind of starts to look a little bit like an investor. And so I'm an engineer, I'm a patent attorney, I'm an entrepreneur. And I was like, all right, well, I'm going to go ahead and layer on something else. And I shadowed a bunch of investors, I read a bunch of books, I joined a bunch of clubs, and I started thinking about taking on clients as if I was an investor.
Seems like a pretty good idea. And so we're going to break format a little bit. And what Jeff's going to provide today is something that he did when we took students out to San Francisco in February. It was amazing. A couple lightning talks, 5 to 7 minute conversations of expertise that he's gained over his years that he wants to dispel upon you. So Haley, if you don't mind, advance that slide, please. Right? That's high quality sound effects right there.
I feel that.
I know, you feel that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, take it away.
The investor mindset that I've had and kind of developed, I've now invested in about 300 companies. I got lucky. I was the first investor in Twilio. I actually negotiated 1% of Duo security, and we didn't sign, or Doug didn't sign. And he ended up taking money from Resonant Ventures, which I was an LP with, so I was kind of okay, but that's another story for another time.
Before we get down to that story, how many of you know of Twilio? You got to tell them the 30 seconds of why Twilio matters to everybody in this room.
So every single time you open an app and you place a phone call or you make a text message through another app, it's most likely Twilio. And so they created the API that allows any web developer to make phone calls and text messages.
Founded by a U of M alum.
Jeff Lawson, I met here when I was in Ann Arbor, and we started doing the Twilio work. They launched from our office. They had a beautiful IPO. You know, at some point they were worth $20, $30 billion in market cap.
So, thanks for the segue.
Yep. So the investor mindset that I came up with and developed over the course of a couple hundred investments is this idea called FIT. And it stands for Founder, Insight, and Timing. And for me, founder is always a technical founder. And it is, you know, we work in deep tech. I'm a patent attorney. The investments that I make are in deep tech. And so it's a technical founder that can pitch and that can hire and can lead. And those things are actually really hard to have. These are often folks that are coming out of a PhD program, and now all of a sudden they're emerging out of the lab that they've been in for 5 or 6 years, and all of a sudden getting out of the building and being able to pitch. And so the idea around, does this person have enough charisma to be able to convince other people? Do they have this long-term, beautiful, big vision? And do they have the kind of this way to convince others of this particular vision? They don't have to be the charismatic person, the most charismatic person in the room, and they often aren't. But they need to be able to be convincing in kind of what they have and to be able to express and articulate that particular vision. Doug Song and Jeff Lawson were both incredible at this, both absolutely brilliant technical founders, and were able to convince others. Kyle Voigt of Cruise is another example of just absolutely brilliant, but that had enough charisma to be able to pitch. And so that's what I think of when I think about founder. Insight, I love the Peter Thiel 0 to 1 book, and in that book, Peter Thiel talks about a secret, the secret that the founder knows that no one else knows. And so I think of this as like very much a contrarian view, that everyone will know this eventually, but they don't know it yet. That's really hard because most of the time a view that no one else holds is often wrong, but that is the game of startups. And so in my mind, a contrarian view, a contrarian insight is really something that's born out of some kind of experience. It could be a pure accident, like, oh my God, I didn't think this was going to work, and it worked out incredibly well. It could be tons of years of hard work. I worked as a PhD and then a postdoc, and I'm the only one in the world that knows that this material can do this particular thing under these particular circumstances. It could be that this particular person just has a really interesting, diverse background. Just the way that they were raised or the experiences that they have, they are able to put together some things that other people just can't. But that contrarian insight is something that we look for. And the last thing is something that's kind of external to all of this, which I think of in terms of timing or trends. And like, what are the other things outside in the world that are basically going to conspire to make this easier for this particular startup. And it could be the IRA, the act within the United States to be able to push hydrogen and to make it cheaper over the next 5-10 years. That's an external thing, a trend. It could be the electrification of basically every single thing on the planet. But these are big, massive trends that are going to allow now to be the right time for this startup to exist.
FIT, F-I-T. This is what you come to. Okay. And what Jeff is not what he's underselling and not really telling you is the notion of investing in Twilio when you did. Tell them what you did with the pizza box and like how early stage you're actually talking about investing.
And so when I invest, there's no projections, there's no revenue, like there's sometimes not even a prototype. And so all you really have is a person and their idea. And so I needed some kind of framework because like the mind will kind of trick you into like all these risks. And the gut will be like, oh my God, I really love this person. We should just invest. And it's really, really, really tricky. But this particular framework just allowed me to be able to take a step back and be like, is this a great technical founder that could pitch? Is this a contrarian insight that was born out of some great truth, but no one else knows yet? And is now the right time to actually make this? And with Twilio, Jeff?
Because at that point, when you're talking about Twilio, you didn't have fit. You didn't, this is a still...
Well, no, so it's not product market fit. Like that's not...
No, I mean, you didn't have the knowledge to have fit, right?
No.
This is like an early in your career.
That was investment in number 11, and the first 10 went to 0. And so thankfully, I stuck it through to 11. But at that time, it was... I knew that particular person well. I knew the founder. They had an insight that was believable, but it was like hard to wrap my head around. B2D like didn't exist. Twilio invented that concept that they would have a business that sold to developers. That literally that phrase just didn't even exist back then. And so he pitched 86 venture funds before the first one said yes. And so. This is the big
That's
big
86
company.
regrets, I guarantee it.
Yeah. So this is something that is very, very difficult to believe. Those are the big companies.
Okay. So this all goes down because Jeff Lawson, who again, when you're thinking about this, Jeff and Jeff, they know each other because they were in your boat. They were students like you. They were sitting here. They were working in Ann Arbor. They were trying to understand the startup scene, working on ideation at that point in time. So again, as you're in these classes and you're talking to each other, you don't know who might be next to you. You have no idea who you might develop a relationship with that might benefit in 15 years, 20 years down the road. They're out in San Francisco. Jeff Lawson, the CEO, founder of Twilio, as I've heard you say, didn't have money to buy a pizza.
So I bought him one. That was the night that they actually launched Twilio, and they launched from my office. I bought the pizzas there. They had the burn down list of all the things that they had to do before they launched on the pizza box, and that pizza box, was in behind a frame, like in their office, for a decade or two.
And when you invested in them, you're talking about. I know how much you invested, but tell them how much you invested, what that meant to you and your personal finances at that point in time, the scope of risk you were taking.
It was 50 grand. It was an enormous amount of money. I think it was basically drained the entire bank account that I had. I had 10 other investments that went to 0. I have really no idea why my wife was so patient and so awesome over this whole thing, but she just kept on saying, we're going to get it one of these times.
That's love.
And I feel that. And the interesting thing about investing is you don't know for another decade whether or not you made a good decision. And so there's absolutely 0 feedback loop. You can't say, oh, that was a really great decision 10 years ago. I'll make more decisions like that. The world's changed. And so there is basically no feedback loop in venture, which is a whole nother story.
Amazing. Okay. So the first stage, to your point, you make those other investments, they fail. Twilio, you don't know is going to pay off and be successful yet, but in fact, you're hitting on something. And along the way of going about doing this, you're understanding that there's a situation here about investing in your own clientele.
And so that's what we started doing, and it came out of my own bank account for a while. We did some balance sheet investments out of the law firm, and then I would end up raising a small fund that would invest in our clients. And at some point, Riley Brennan, another Michigan grad, who also grew up in Michigan, just about a mile or two away from me in Birmingham, also had a stint in General Motors. We ended up forming Trucks together.
Yeah, and Trucks is a venture capital firm invests in transportation startups, mobility-related startups. And so, if you don't know
we're
venture,
the first investor in May, and that's a great Ann Arbor startup.
Yeah, May Mobility for sure. I'm thinking that, like, if you don't know venture and you don't know startup, the notion of like putting that kind of money in that early is crazy. And what's so contrarian to Jeff's point about kind of what they were doing that he's not even really highlighting because he's a humble guy, is that the notion that clients were saying, hey, we'll pay you in equity, we don't really have money to buy your services, but we'd be happy to give you some shares. Like, that's the light bulb. That's an epiphany moment of there's a different way to do this.
It was already kind of investing our bandwidth. It was like choosing which one to actually take on as a client. And so it was a natural selection, or a natural kind of progression into, well, we should just invest as well. And that's what kind of started to build the portfolio. We've had a couple of great unicorns that had early investments in. Some that are still kind of in the phase of like working their way through the system, and hopefully we'll have a nice IPO in a couple of years.
Okay, shifting gears. When we started this class, I asked a lot of you what you want to do, if you want to be founders, what career paths you'd like to go down. A lot of you did raise your hand and say, yeah, it's something I'm interested in. If you're going to do that, you have to have at least some understanding of what it means to have a patent and why patents are important. Give them the lightning talk on patents, and Haley, if you wouldn't mind cracking the thunder again in the back. Next slide, that would be. Thank you. It's just a little delayed.
Notice in my FIT framework, IP is not in there. And that was something that took me a long time to learn. As a patent attorney, I kind of thought the entire world revolved around intellectual property. And so my first 10 investments were really around like who had the best patents. And then I learned maybe it's not really about the patents, maybe it's about the technology. And maybe it's not really about the technology, maybe it's about the insight. But it took me a long time to figure that out. I think that one of the mistakes that a lot of early stage companies make is they put too much emphasis on patents. And patents are kind of a proxy for insight, but it's no substitute for founder, and it's definitely no substitute for timing. And so I think a lot of folks will say, well, we have patents, and that's going to be the thing that opens the door to a lot of venture capital. And honestly, that's not it at all at the early stage. It's really about founder. It's really about their insights. It's really about their timing. Patents are important. Don't get me wrong, I'm still a patent attorney. I love my job, and I feel like what we do is incredibly important. But it's something that it becomes more and more important over time. Series A, it starts to become a little bit more important. Series B, it becomes very important. By the time you get an exit, it's incredibly important. When Cruise was acquired by General Motors, which was a client of ours, and we built out their patent portfolio, in their SEC report by General Motors, it was $120 million for the intellectual property. We had filed 12 patents, so everyone here is smart enough to do that math. Like, it was an incredible return on the legal fees that they had spent. These were some great ideas, but that didn't necessarily help the Series B or A or seed rounds, but it helped enormously at the exit. And so, as an early stage founder, have a slide, have an appendix, something that talks about patents and talks about intellectual property, but don't lead with that. You should lead with yourself, with the team, and the insight that you have. And so that's the first thing. Don't overemphasize IP early on. The other is basically the flip-flop of that, which is don't forget it. And so just because a seed investor is not asking about it, that doesn't mean that you should wait too long. When Coinbase came to us and asked us to build their patent portfolio, it was already a Series C company. And the way the patent law works is that if you wait more than a year after you have publicly disclosed your invention, you can't file it. It's already gone. It's in the public domain. And so don't wait too long to start a patent portfolio. Somewhere around seed is a great time to start building a patent portfolio. You've already raised a little bit of money. Start filing some provisional patent applications. Not a ton, maybe it's a handful, like 2 or 3, particularly if you have a great technical insight, but start building it from there. For Twilio, we had 75 patents by the time they exited. For Duo, I think it was 60 or 65. And so, but we got there by filing a handful a year. It wasn't 75 in the beginning. It wasn't 75, at year 10, but rather 2 or 3 or 4 on an annual basis. And so that's the don't wait too late aspect of it. The third mistake is really around cost. I've had a couple of attorneys in my life. I bought a house here in Ann Arbor that had a bunch of easements from a foundation that had easements on the house. And I remember engaging the best property attorney here in Ann Arbor, and I got the bill, and I basically had a heart attack. It was a number they had never seen. It was $7,500, and I don't know what I was expecting, but it was an enormous number, and it was just the pit in my throat. When we went to create the first Trucks Fund. We went to Gunderson, the best attorneys in the world, to form a venture fund. And the fees were $100,000 or something. And I was like, well, this is only going to be a $15 million fund. $100,000 sounds like a lot of money. And so we did it really cheaply. And then when we raised the second fund, we went back to Gunderson. And Gunderson was like, why did you do this in your first fund? And we're like, oh, that's just what we thought we were supposed to do. And they're like, well, had you come to us, we would have encouraged you to have a step-up function and carry. And we're like, I don't even know what that is. And they're like, well, if you make a certain amount, return 3x to your investors, then you could step it up to 30% carry instead of a 20% carry. It could turn out that was about a $10 to $15 million mistake, just to save a little bit of dollars in legal fees. And so lawyers, it's a really great marketplace. If someone is charging an enormous amount of money, it's probably because they're really good. And if you're going to only be filing 2 or 3 patents in the first couple of years, you kind of want them to be good. And another way of thinking of this is that you don't want to fail at the patent office. Because when you fail, you're taking your best ideas and you're going to the patent office, and the patent office says, sorry, that patent application wasn't good enough. And it goes into the public domain. And it has your name on it. So all your competitors could find it, and it's now there. This is our best idea. This is how you do it. And everyone is now free to use it because it's in the public domain. And so I think a lot of people don't really realize the true cost of patent law, which is avoid failure. File on the right things and avoid failure. And to do that, it's expensive. And one of the last things that I would encourage people, if they are to engage a patent attorney, is to find someone who's really passionate about what you're doing and motivated to work with you. I've done my best work for folks that I absolutely love, and I wake up in the middle of the night thinking about how I can make those applications better. And the ones that I'm not passionate about, you kind of just end up calling it in. That's just how life works. And so find someone who really gets what you're doing and is excited to be able to help you.
So much to unpack from that. I love it. One of the things I want to underline in bold red marker is this is coming from somebody who just told you failed on several investments early on, failed in his thought of what his career was going to be at automotive and GM. But the one thing he's telling you don't fail on is patents. So it's not that failure is bad. It's not that it's not important. It's not don't take a risk. It's if you're going to do one thing right, make sure that's the one you have buttoned down before you do it, okay? Fair to say?
Fair to say.
Okay. The other part I want to unpack a little bit is this, this notion that you touched on of looking at post-sales and bring something to market and the timeline associated with filing a patent around that. You briefly touched on it, but unpack a little bit about what that timeline looks like.
It's super clear at the patent office. If you've offered something for sale or you've publicly disclosed it, it was in your thesis and that was published, you have 1 year from that date. You've already lost your foreign rights. You won't be able to file a patent application in anywhere else outside of the United States. But at least in the United States, you have a year. Try to get in front of that. There's this thing called a provisional patent application. It's cheaper, it's lighter, it's easier. It's perfect for startups. We use it 95, 98% of the time. And you could do it yourself. That's actually the class that I teach, is teaching engineers how to write their own provisional application. And so it's something that you could do. It's not particularly hard. It's not actually legalese. It's more technical in nature. And try to get a filing before you publicly disclose.
And one of the myths that I like that you dispel when you're talking about the patent application process is everyone's understanding of what they think the application of patents is to software.
Duo, we filed 60. Twilio, we filed 75. Software is absolutely patentable. There's a lot of software that's not, because you're just connecting the pipes, or you're taking something, a big chunk of software code from somewhere else and just putting it together into your code base. And of course, that's not patentable. But if you are pitching your company as a technical powerhouse, as someone who's kind of figured something out that no one else knows yet, there's most likely something there that's patentable. There's plenty of things within software. Software is just a way to implement inventions and ideas. And there's going to be lots of those ideas that aren't patentable because they've already been done. But the ones that are on the cutting edge are absolutely patentable.
Okay. Let's go back to another lightning talk here. This is somebody who went to school to become a mechanical engineer in automotive and said, no, I'm not going to do that. To become a lawyer, said, I'm going to do some of that, but not really all of that. And he decided to do something else and become VC and so on. Haley, if you wouldn't mind advancing to the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to have career experiences. Oh, boom.
Steve Jobs said that you really could only understand a career afterwards, and you kind of connect all the dots. And I generally agree with that, but there's some kind of an approach that I may have accidentally stumbled into, and I would love to share that. And so I thought I was going to be a mechanical engineer. That's what I wanted to do, automotive. And I got there and I was like, I like a bunch of these things, but not all of it. And so I ended up going into patent law. To be a patent attorney, you have to be an engineer. And so I used all of these layers of this knowledge, this degree that I already had, and then layered on top of that law. I was a patent attorney for 5-6 years, and I wanted to start my own firm. To start your own firm in patent law, you have to be a patent attorney. And so I layered another piece on top of that, which is entrepreneurship. And I became my own CEO and started my own firm. And then after many years after that, I layered on another piece, which was investor. We were going to invest in the clients of my patent firm. And so every single one of those layers depended on the layer beneath it. And so I kind of think of this as like a gin rummy card game or something. And I was given 5 cards, and maybe one of them was like a jack or a 10 or something, and the other cards were kind of crap. And so I turned in 3 or 4 cards, and I got a bunch of cards back. And so I built upon like what I had, and I tried to kind of build the best hand I could. I've seen other people in their career just kind of throw in all their cards and ask for another 5 cards back. I think it's kind of a gamble, to do that at like age 30 or 40 or whenever that is. And for me, it worked out incredibly well, being able to say, all right, I love this aspect, I love the technical part, but I wanted to be more in a service-oriented profession. I wanted a place where a meritocracy, more of a meritocracy than I saw at General Motors. And from there, it was like I wanted to add this other layer of I could do something a little bit different, or I could do something a little bit better, or I could focus on a particular type of client that we couldn't at the firm that I was at. And then from there, it was I had this opportunity to think about clients and taking on clients like as an investor. And all along the way, it turned out that it was my interests that kind of led me to the skills that then led me to that next level of professional. Of like I was interested in cars, that led me to that. I was interested in some of the technology and being a professional service provider, and that led me to that. I was interested in entrepreneurship, and I was super intrigued. That led me to the next level. All of our clients were raising money. These are great leaders. These are great CEOs. I learned so much from them. I learned a ton from Jen Baird on like how to be a great CEO and an amazing entrepreneur here in Ann Arbor. And so I was taking all of these things and kind of folding them back into the firm that I was building, trying to absorb as much as I could along the way. And so that's kind of how I see the career now when I look back on it, was that it was basically just either stairs or layers to kind of get to where I'm at today.
And that have become additive and brought it to each other. To a large degree, when I was thinking about, and so I started CFE 9 years ago. Jeff was one of the first people I met because he was the chair of our advisory board, and he's been an active supporter since day one of CFE being founded and really building the foundation that y'all are benefiting from today. And I was thinking about, like, what is Jeff? How would I describe Jeff to people and the like? And I was like, he's thoughtful. He's thoughtful. That's about the most succinct way I can think to possibly put it. You're intentional, you're strategic, you're empathetic, and you're kind, and you're just a thoughtful person. You approach your career that way, you approach relationships that way, investing that way. Unpack how they can otherwise either realize their superpower in being thoughtful as it is to you, or understand how to be more thoughtful as they approach their career, their degree, their interests that they're seeking out. How have you continued to hone that?
I was raised in a family that had a ton of empathy, and so we listened a lot. We were great communicators, and so I think as engineers, we don't often think of ourselves as great communicators, but I think that's what you do with your friends in a social life, you can bring into a business life in terms of like how you listen and how you care about the other people that you work with. I think sometimes, and this is an amazing contrast because I lived in DC for a little bit. And the feeling that I had at that time, this is my own personal experience, and at that era, was that everyone was there to basically climb as fast as they could in a short period of time. And I was really repulsed by that. And this idea of like, I don't want to kumbaya, like all sit around and hug, but there was this moment of like, understanding others and what they're trying to accomplish and how I could help, and making sure that people understood who I was and what I was trying to accomplish, and being vulnerable for others to be able to hear that story and my story. And I think that was a piece of this. I think I was also pretty lucky along the way. And I think that I've kind of manifested luck. And I think luck is a little bit of just a mindset. My mom used to tell me that I was like super lucky, and so I just believed that. And I think when you believe that you're lucky, then you kind of look for things in a serendipitous way. You just kind of like, oh, I wonder what's going to happen today. I'm a lucky person. What am I going to stumble into? What's the universe going to kind of provide and show up at my doorstep today? And so I had this kind of openness to other things. And I had this kind of willingness to kind of follow. And I combined that feeling of luckiness with this kind of sense of being really thoughtful. And those things worked really well together. I've made a couple of enormous leaps in my career. So much so that in many, many times in my life, best friends, family members sat me down and said, I know you think about things a lot, but you haven't thought about this thing that you're about to do enough. like, you are being absolutely batshit crazy right now. And like, intervention level from families and friends multiple times in my life. The first was to go into patent law. Like, no one in my family was a lawyer. And so the idea of going to law school was just like insanity. Later on, when I started my own firm, it was rumored that I was going to be the youngest partner of that firm. It's 200 people, 150 years old. And I was going to leave to start my own firm. Like, it was absolutely crazy. And then I was going to move to California, where I didn't know anyone other than one person. Like, absolutely crazy. And so all of these moments were things that I was open to, and I kind of felt lucky that like the opportunity presented itself, but also something that like I had journaled and that I thought strategically about, and kind of had lots of different multiple paths in my future of like where I could potentially go. And I thought deeply about all of those. And at some point along the timeline, most of those kind of presented themselves.
And I just don't want to end class without talking about this in any way. One of the things that you've done to bring that opportunity and to bring that luck to a position to then helping those who otherwise maybe don't have that, or who have not been in a position to otherwise benefit from having the opportunities that have come that way, is what you've done through the foundation and through the Schox Fund. Can you unpack that for them? Tell them about what it means to actually select the grantees that you've had, what basis that was on,
Sure.
the type of charities that...
And this is going to sound a little funny, but there was this moment that I realized that, if the investments go well, like, I'm going to know a bunch of billionaires. And it sounds funny to say, like, and I'm sure it sounds really funny to hear, but I know 5 or 6 billionaires. And I couldn't even possibly imagine, like, sitting in undergrad or a grad school, like saying like, oh, like that's gonna be my life at some point. I'm not one, by the way. But I've had the incredible opportunity to work with some really, really amazing startups. And so along the way, like, in talking to these folks as they become billionaires, it's like, well, I don't know how to give. I've never really practiced. And so we had this crazy idea of like, well, let's practice philanthropy while founders are in the early stages. And of course, early stage founders don't have an ability to really practice philanthropy because all they really have is equity. And so the idea was like to create this circle where a bunch of founders would put 1% into this circle. And if any of those founders had an exit, then we would share it equally across all of those founders. My wife, has been deep into philanthropy for a very long time, basically her entire life.
Michigan education grad.
Was like, hey, I'll go out and interview these founders, figure out what they're interested in, and I'll find the nonprofits that are doing great work in that space, early stage nonprofits. And we'll present 3 or 4 of them to each of those founders. And those founders could then, with basically somebody else's money, now practice philanthropy. That's worked incredibly well. We're on our 4th distribution right now. Ben of Compology, also a Michigan grad, was able to exit his particular company, and we're in the process right now of distributing his grant.
Ben, you haven't met yet. He was in EHour last semester. Ben, in 2011, was in your seat as a student, founded a company, full circle now in that way. And then one of the organizations that you funded that I just think the world of is Annie Cannons. And if you don't know what Annie Cannons is, give him the spiel.
My wife would do a much better job, but these are folks that have had in a very difficult position, generally sexually trafficked people that are now kind of reintroduced into the world in a way and supported to be able to have a greater life after that.
Yeah, teaching the code. So that's not a one-time thing, but it's actually sustainable.
Absolutely.
I know we've got a myriad of student questions, but there were a couple that came through that I really wanted to call out. Michael Hinson, you in here? No? Alexander Bartlett? No? Evan Heckman? Oh, hey, bud.
I actually have a different question.
Oh, pivot. There you go.
I like what you said about I loved what you had to say about investing, not having a feedback loop, and I was wondering how you improve on your decisions if there is no feedback loop to learn from.
Yeah, so what I ended up doing is thinking if I could pick companies that would end up raising a next round, that would be the best proxy I could possibly get to getting a company that would make it all the way to an exit. And so I use that as kind of like my best metric. It's not an exit. It's not the same thing as an exit at all. But at some point in my career, I had made like 20 or 30 investments in a row that had all went on to raise their next round. And so that was something I was incredibly proud of.
Thank you.
Yep.
That's awesome. And then Giselle Solomon, you in here? Oh, right over here. Yeah, right.
I was wondering how you're able to manage your hobbies and like your interests. Oh, thanks. I was wondering how you were able to manage your hobbies and or your interests that don't involve your occupation while like still maintaining a good work balance.
I think work-life balance is incredibly important, but I also think that it's going to just change over time. In my 20s, I worked incredibly hard. And it was something that I was able to kind of build enough momentum to be able to kind of launch my career in a particular way. In my 30s, I built a bunch of new things. That's when I started my own firm, and that was when I actually went back to school. And this is when we ended up moving to the Bay Area. And so kind of like building was that part of my 30s. At the end of my 30s, I ended up starting a family with my wife. And so those different pieces along the way, I think it's incredibly useful to think of like just different phases of a life and how the balance might be a little bit different in those different phases. I happen to be lucky in the sense that some of the things that give me great joy are also really good for my mental health. And I didn't really know that until later, but I love to run and I love to hike. And those things are just really, really good for mental health. And so those were places, when I hiked, I was able to kind of work through a bunch of issues. My wife and I went on walks multiple times a day, and we were able to kind of efficiently work through things in our relationship, but also get exercise at the same time, and also kind of clear my brain. And so I ended up doing a bunch of hobbies that had this kind of beautiful flywheel effect in my life. Again, just kind of lucky.
And you can too. Thank you, Jeff.
One really quick thing is that everyone here in this room is incredibly lucky. This is the University of Michigan, and to be a Michigan grad is incredibly lucky. And to take that feeling and go do great things with it.